And we are recording. Oh, and we get to admit one more person here. Okay, so for people that aren't familiar with this, we're kind of doing this every month, doing a different virtual behavior chat during our lovely pandemic, with today being Reptile-Focused with Peter, Amelia, and Carrie Davis from Reptelligence.
Woo!
And yeah, we're gonna talk all about that. Was too much, Carrie? All right,
Oh,
already.
sorry.
Down, Carrie.
Bring it down. Bring it down.
Tone it down. No. I'm sure there will be a lot of jokes because Carrie and Peter and I all know each other very well. But otherwise, I mean, this is really as wide of a topic area that we've thrown out there, and these chats have been very informal to begin with, but we just let people type into chat, ask questions. But this one's really the focus. The only real focus is on reptile behavior. So it's pretty much everything that is related to reptile behavior in terms of enrichment, training, and general welfare. And we can even get into some stuff, although way outside of my expertise, because we're already outside of my wheelhouse. It's welfare measures that are not necessarily behavior, but are related to reptiles, depending on what people want to ask in terms of that. So that said, that's almost as long of talking in any one long interval that I want to do. So Peter, Carrie, you have anything you want to add, or do people want to start typing into chat?
Would you like us to do like a mini intro on who we are I mean, everyone knows who we are, obviously, I'm sure. Okay, right. Sounds like John would like that. John, I also was going to say, I think it is notable how amazing your beard is. And I just feel like that's something I needed to say out loud. So I support this. I'll go first since I'm already talking and I feel the need to apologize for the birds. So there are some parrots screaming in the background, which if you have ever heard a podcast that I've done or been to any of my classes, you are aware of. My name's Peter. I use they, them pronouns. I am a positive reinforcement-based, least restrictive trainer. That's how I usually focus things. I'm specializing in exotics in general, but mostly with birds of all species and reptiles. Most of my reptile training I've done is with snakes. A couple years ago, Carrie and I met online and became fast friends. And so now I am the director of training and media and one of the teachers for the Reptelligence courses. And so Carrie and I teach that course. We just finished our second one up. In fact, we have a lot of students here, which is awesome because I know everyone, myself, are both of us included, we're really sad that our class is over now. And so it's nice to be able to see everyone's faces again. And then there was something else I was gonna say, and it's escaping me right now. So
we have a couple hours, so
we've got some time.
Yeah, you've got some time to remember what you need to say. Yeah. Carrie, you want to add?
I'm Carrie. I use she, her pronouns. I was a professional dog trainer. I worked in zoos for a long time. Started Reptelligence about 8 years ago now. Gosh. And
I guess 8.
It's kind of continued to evolve based on whatever is kind of seen as being needed. One of the main goals was to establish a community where we can grow and learn from each other, and I feel like we've gone a long ways towards achieving that. So I'm really happy about that. Really excited in the last couple of years to be able to work with Peter and start to offer courses.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Short and sweet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm Eduardo. Eddie. I'm not that concerned about whether you call me Eddie or Eduardo. He,
Ed.
him, Ed. No, let's not go with Ed. Ed,
I think we both are approving people simultaneously. I think we're all like
Wait,
clicking on adding
what
people.
happened? What happened? Stop.
Are you not around now?
Carrie keeps muting me. So
I was
there's
just
that.
trying to let people in the room, and like the mouse
And she's
keeps
just
jumping.
muting me in the process. She's just like, stop talking. So the only other thing I will add before Carrie mutes me again is
I'm not going to admit anyone. Peter can admit them.
it's all right. We're on it. I'm a senior lecturer of animal behavior, welfare, and ethics in the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Even though I am not in Australia right now because of COVID, that's part of the purpose of these virtual talks. And this will be up on my YouTube channel in the next couple days after we finish the talk. But I am a behavior analyst, applied ethologist, animal welfare scientist. Most of my focus is on applied animal behavior research in general. And I have interest in reptile behavior, reptile training, although I am far from being a herp expert by any means. Far from that. So that's part of why I wanted to get this chat going too, because I feel like there's really a lot of limited information out there, and I can talk a little bit about what we know from the applied animal behavior and experimental animal behavior perspective with reptiles. But really, there's not that much known scientifically in terms of caring for the welfare of the behavioral welfare of reptiles. So with that in mind, I don't know, where do you all want to start talking?
I think one thing that would be helpful is when if people have thoughts or questions, that's going to really help us kind of steer our conversation. I feel like Carrie and I basically do this all the time, just without an audience. We just sit up at like 2 a.m. and like talk about what we are thinking about in terms of training. I guess I would say on the note of like there not being a whole lot out there, I'm so happy to see like that we're like there is more of a community in terms of people training and stuff. And the thing is too is that like Carrie and I are not the only trainers out there. There are definitely other people doing it, and I'm sure there are lots of people doing stuff that don't necessarily have a presence on social media, which is where a lot of this focuses. And there tends to be which I'm happy to see there's less of a gap there, especially in teaching courses. But there tends to be somewhat of a gap between the more companion animal pet owner side versus the zoo side, which I would like to see broaden, because I think we all have a lot to offer each other in terms of just the different species we work with and all that kind of thing. I think one thing I'm very happy about with training and the stuff that we're doing is that I think people seeing these animals that are traditionally thought of as very robotic, very instinct driven, seeing them thinking, solving problems, working in the way that we kind of have slowly started to, that we start to see dogs and maybe horses and more like macro animals that people think of when they think of training is really exciting. And I'm often returned to the thought that, you know, there was a time when we all thought dolphins were dumb fish, right? And so I think that reptiles are just another step along our understanding of intelligence and learning capabilities in animals. And I'm really excited to see how that's going to do and change their opinion from not just a conservation standpoint, but just from people like feeling better about living around wild animals, especially within the reptile. Is there a way to like The dinging is very loud.
It's just going to be through your computer. It shouldn't. Here, I'll go ahead and mute the because
Okay.
I'm keeping
Because
an
it
eye on
pops up,
it.
so yeah. Okay, cool.
So we will get to that question in a second. I did want to start off with a couple things based on what Peter was saying. So a couple interesting parts there, which was one is it's pretty amazing to see even so I met with the animal behavior undergraduate students at Adelaide to talk to them about research possibilities in animal behavior, and some of them are interested in doing honors theses, and just even within that group there were 3 or so people that asked questions specifically about reptiles and reptile behavior and what's possible. So it's really an expanding area. But Peter, you got at a really important point too, which is that I think the way that people used to and still do in many cases. I mean, I know it's not atypical if I talk about something like alligator training or some of the little bit of work I've done in the past, where people say, "Oh, you can train them." So you'll hear comments like that quite often, and they say the same thing about invertebrates, and it's pretty. And there is a robust literature out there from an experimental standpoint that goes back 50 plus years from people like Bitterman and the like, who have done all kinds of work with learning. But the reptile stuff has still been pretty limited, even from an experimental standpoint, from behavior, and then applied behavior, it's been extraordinarily limited. So there is a review that came out last year on the use of enrichment with reptiles by
Is that the
Taylor
one?
Egan. Taylor Egan
Oh, okay.
put it out in JAWS. But so there's a lot of work to be done. I guess that's the point. And John Coe, who's here, who has done amazing work all around the world in developing exhibits for a variety of different animals. John and I I'm collaborating with him on some work with trying to set up these exhibits that hopefully will offer reptiles some choices out for new Australia exhibit. I don't, John, at some point, it would be great to have you type into chat, or we'll unmute you and you can explain a little more about some of the exhibit design work that you've done in the past and what we'll do. But for what's that, John? Oh, sorry. I'm gonna unmute John really quickly because
Okay, I'm happy to do that, and I also have a series of questions, and I don't actually know how you type in questions.
no worries.
So
We can
I
just
can give
unmute.
them verbally, but I
Yeah.
don't know where to type them.
Yeah.
To give a little direction to this, I have a special interest, as Eduardo said. I'm one of the people that designed the overall facility that you guys manage. And obviously I want to work very closely with all the managers to make sure that what we do is realistic and desirable. And, I keep saying that enrichment is only good if it enriches both the animals and the caregivers and the visitors and the whole team. It's not a one-way relationship. So my question really has to do with what I call animal rotation or animal alternation. I've done a lot of work with primates and big cats, other terrestrial animals, where they take turns on a time-sharing basis using different enclosures. For example, at Louisville Zoo, we have orangs and siamangs and babirusa pigs and tapirs and tigers all taking turns in the same 5 exhibits on a timeshare basis. And we found it very enriching to the animals. And then the second thing we've done is set up long overhead trail systems. For example, Philadelphia Zoo, where everything from a mangabey to a pygmy marmoset can take themselves for a walk for a kilometer across the zoo in this overhead trail system. And I'm saying, why can't we do that for reptiles? And so part of my question is, how do we manage that in terms of their feeding regime? For example, is it feasible that if we feed them small amounts more often, they can be a whole lot more active and go into hunting modes and have a reason to go places. And then, how do we manage that interface between, all of these rotation things that we've worked on absolutely depend on the training and the goodwill of the animal. And they have a choice. They can go for a walk or not. The gate's open. But I would like to hear you guys talk a little about, how that would be done from a practical point of view so that these animals really get good physical condition. I see tigers, and I certainly see snakes that are just, there's just no muscle tone in them. They're just, a weak sausage lying there and have never had any exercise. And so how do we, how can we manage that? And I can work on the design side of it if I can get help on, on the practical side of how we do that. And the idea of rotating, is that a problem, with the scent of the previous animal that was there, or can, we drag a food item through there ahead of time and they'll track it, or, how would we go about that? So those are my questions, and what I'm hoping to get out of this meeting is some inspiration and practical ideas along those lines.
Yeah, John, let me say really quickly, we've got everybody else's. We're going to deal with some of John's questions first, and we've got everybody's chat here. And then, John, what I'm going to do is go ahead and put you back on mute now, or maybe I won't. I don't know. We'll see, depending on how fast I get over there. But, Jane Ann gave me a tour years ago of the facility, that area that you helped set up with the Sumatran tigers and the orangs and the tapirs. And it was really fascinating to see what John was talking about there was just that for every one of their enclosures for these, I think 5 different species of animals. So I mentioned 3 of them. 6? Okay. So for all of those animals, they will be rotated depending on the day, sometimes even within a day, to a different exhibit. So what would happen is Sumatran tigers would go into an exhibit that was previously tapirs or orangs. So that in and of itself can function potentially as enrichment, and they move around. And I know, John, we've talked a little bit in some of our discussions about creating this reptile exhibit out in Victoria, about how that would work, and then also this issue of choice. So giving these lizards and the skinks more options for where they can be and what they can do on exhibit. But that's my only contribution there. And I think at the end, well, I'll finish with saying this. A lot of these are empirical questions. And I love to say that. Peter knows how much I love to say empirical questions. And what I ultimately mean when I say it's an empirical question is, I mean, we don't have a definitive answer because we don't have the data yet. So that to me is one of the most integral parts is, can we get more data? Yeah, John.
So I want to add that for all of you to understand, we've talked about this for a while, but we actually have a project that's going to get built. And right now we've done the preliminary design and it's being the cost estimates are being done. We don't know if we can afford it, but our plan that Eddie and I worked out with a regional herpetologist here in Victoria, Australia, is that let's design the whole process from the beginning. In other words, let's design the research, let's design the design, let's design the training, let's design all of those things from the beginning. And to the extent possible, let's do all the before tests. Let's find out where these reptiles are that we're going to move here. And let's find out what they do for a living and how do they spend their time and all those things before they come. And then probably for a period of time in their, I'll call it their home base enclosure. And then, start moving them around and seeing what we find from this. And so, we're trying to package this whole thing, before and after studies, research, the training, the keeper training, the whole package, rather than just, typically I go out and design something that gets built and then we figure out how to use it. And, and gee, why didn't we think of that? So it's this integrated process I'm really interested in. And, and what we can anticipate from the beginning and what we have to look out for example, as we go along.
Yeah.
That's the background.
Carrie, I have some thoughts, and then I feel like you have thoughts too. can I go first?
Sure.
Okay. First off, John, I can just say that Carrie and I really want to be of as much help as possible for this. It's super exciting. I think that's really wonderful. That would be so cool. I love so much that you brought up there. I think in terms of, so as Carrie will tell you, I'm really into fitness and behavior, specifically in terms of like muscle building and all that kind of thing. My other profession is I'm a professional circus artist and coach. And so my whole life revolves around watching bodies and having them operate and all that kind of thing. And you're right, obesity and lack of muscle is really, really common in the reptile world. Especially with some of the, like, for instance, bearded dragons, leopard geckos, and savanna monitors always seem to be on a diet. And snakes are fed in a way that we're getting more and more studies on it being detrimental to their longevity and general health and welfare. So I think one thing to consider is that some species, as I'm sure you've had, some species are probably going to be better set up for situations like that than others. So for instance, like, and I don't know this, but my anticipation would be that, for instance, an eastern indigo snake, like I have over there, the males will have approximately the same travel distance as pride of lions. So they will have huge spanses of Florida that they exhibit and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, excuse me, when we're looking at maybe a green tree python, we're looking at a slightly more possibly sedentary life, but at the same time, they don't necessarily not move. Their movement is just less space, or it's more vertical up and down. So they'll spend their days up higher. And then as they go younger, especially as younger snakes, they'll go lower in the evening to start hunting. So considering all that, I think would be really important. I have, with biosecurity involved, of course, I will have animals go from different enclosures to other, not typically set up like for them to spend extended periods of time in this other enclosure, but I will have them move around. I haven't ever been concerned, Carrie, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. I haven't ever really been concerned about them smelling other species. Obviously, if I saw a behavior that made me concerned, then I would look at that a little differently. But one thing I will do is place sheds or even bedding of other species in as a way to stimulate certain behaviors into other animals' enclosures. So I think that would be really cool. One of the difficulties I have in terms of doing that kind of timeshare is that I've got a snake from the like elevated parts of Mexico, a snake from the lakes of Mexico, a snake from Oregon, one from Florida, one from the Brazilian rainforest, one from the outback. So in terms of having them go to different enclosures, spending extended periods of time in those different enclosures that are specifically made for a species from a different biome would make that difficult. But I think that if you have a large enough enclosure and can create as many microclimates as you need to, then I think that would be really, really awesome. And one thing I talk about and would love to have is enclosures so large that I can have a heated area that is warm enough that they never use and a cool enough area that is cool enough that they never use. So they have every possible gradient within it. Yeah. Same thing with light and humidity gradients. And I think depending, especially a lot of zoos tend to have really bigger species. So rock pythons, anacondas, the bigger boas. When that starts to happen, I think that when you have species like that, now the enclosure has to be even larger because the microclimate has to be larger for that animal to be able to inhabit it and actually use all of that part of the climate. Like when we're looking at heat lamps, most heat lamps, depending on the species, don't provide a very large range in terms of the gradient starts to fade out really quickly as you get away from the heat lamp. So having a large animal that can't be within that gradient as well. So if you've got one heat lamp, but you have a 12-foot I don't know, reticulated python, that snake is going to take up a lot more space to try and hold a specific microclimate. So I think in my head, you would be looking at really much larger enclosures. And then if you wanted to transfer them from one to the other, you would need to be looking at making sure that those microclimates are still available.
What we're looking at, the director wanted some large animals for, for drama, as well as a range of small and endangered species. And so initially we're looking at a large goanna, from that area, a much larger Asian forest monitor, river monitor, one of those, and probably like a Burmese python or, big python. So we've set up in our initial plan, we have 4 enclosures, which are, between 20 and 25 feet high, as well as being, fairly good sized. And the idea is that they'll have what we call sway branches, natural or artificial trees that move as they climb on them and so forth, so that they can pick the elevation. And since we'll be starting with younger animals, we're assuming they're going to spend more time up high. So as they get up high, they're right under the skylight, as they get down, they're in the cool shade. So the gradients would be really built in. But all 3 of those could be in any one of those 4 enclosures.
Right.
So they all have that characteristic, and they all have some water in them as well. So they can, the desert animal doesn't have to spend its time in the water, can be up on the high rock, But so the idea is to try to have the gradients for all of those. And since all of those really come from dry forest settings, dry forest and woodlands, the ecological story is, for the habitat story isn't all that bad. But I've been a really big advocate of gradients right from the beginning. So I'm really happy to say that. We've also used things like hog warmers.
Pig blankets,
pig blankets instead of lights. And you can arrange those along a log or a rock or under a rock. So you can get quite a big area that's heated. And another thing we've begin working with, though we haven't proven it, is using motion sensors to activate the ambient temperature. So as the animal moves into an area, either RFID or motion sensor then activates the fan or the light or the warmer or the cooler, or whatever it is. So it's animal activated.
Bill Gates has that in his house. When you walk into a room, it sets to the temperature that you want, actually. Yeah, I think I will say one thing on the hog blankets or the pig blankets. So when we're looking at heat, and I can send you some resources in terms of finding out this really specifically, but I can give you like a 101 on it. So there are basically the 3 kinds of infrared. There's A, B, and C. So the thing with heat mats, ceramic heat emitters, pig blankets, they only give off, to my knowledge, ultraviolet C, or not ultraviolet, IRC. And the issue with IRC is that it only provides a very surface level of heat, so it's not deep penetrating. So when we're looking at, and now it's very common to be used within the hobby, especially captivity, they're very low wattage, they don't take up a lot of space, but the issues with those is that they don't really provide the sun's warmth that they're looking for. So especially when we're looking at desert species, we're really trying to aim for IRA and IRB to a lesser degree. And that is much more muscularly deep penetrating. And I've seen myself in my own animals that when I have switched from a ceramic heat emitter or heat mats to halogen lighting is generally, from my research, the best place to get that. In terms of the IRA, what I found with that is that my animals start moving more, digesting food quicker, defecating quicker. And I really think that it's because of the deep tissue warmth that helps in digestion. Now, IRC is always going to be in the environment because IRC is, so if you heat a rock and then the light turns off, but the rock is still warm, the heat that's radiating off of that is IRC. So IRC is not bad, but I am very careful to, whenever possible, make sure it's not the only type of infrared that is there. Carrie, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, going back to enclosure swapping, I would see the bigger challenges being that a lot of times reptiles don't have a lot of exposure to novel stimuli, or if they do, it's very controlled. So it's maybe one or two things. The exception to that would be oftentimes when zoo enclosures and even pet enclosures are cleaned, they are completely stripped clean. Everything is washed and sterilized and put back in. So essentially, sorry. Essentially, it's almost a new enclosure other than the spaces being similar. Scent-wise, what it smells like is quite different. So I don't see a huge difference between that and putting them in a whole new enclosure, honestly. And it's pretty common to do that with a cleaning, which would happen probably not every day. So if you're doing a day-to-day swap, I could see how you'd have to really monitor behavior for what the animals are telling you. But if you're doing like a weekly swap or a bi-weekly swap or a monthly swap, I don't see a huge issue because they would get virtually that anyway with the cleaning structure. But the other side of that is you can certainly prep those animals to accept more novel things by starting to incorporate more novel things into their habitat or offering them enrichment spaces. I know Lori, who's here today, does that a lot already with her things. We certainly do that within the Reptilegence program, where we offer outside of the enclosure spaces to explore, and you can start to get a real idea of what kind of coping mechanisms and what kind of behaviors your animal already has for interacting with new things, and that can really help as far as transitioning them. I think being able to read body language itself is really important, and that's something we haven't probably looked at close enough with all species, as far as coming up with clear ways to tell what is pleasurable or what is good or what is low stress in an animal and what is higher stress. Even within snakes, which I tend to work more closely with more recently, I mean, you could have, oh, this snake is showing a lot of behavior, and it could be a hyperactive behavior where they're actually doing the same behavior over and over again. And so I think having that baseline of what's normal for this individual and this species going into it, you know how to read how they're interacting with those spaces. But I would probably start to collect that kind of data before I actually would start doing the swapping of enclosures, just so you have an idea of what's normal for this animal. And sometimes I've found that when I start to introduce novel things, or when I start to change the handling schedule with an animal, or start to change what I expose them to, I sometimes will see that what I thought was normal is not their normal, or sometimes it is, and being able to compare that and really try to see what is stressful and what is not stressful for this animal, what's more relaxing. And with that, offering more choices, doing that in kind of a controlled way, so it's not just going from a very small space where not much changes to a larger space where everything changes, or even a large space where nothing changes to a large space where everything changes. I think having an idea of what to expect would be good going into that. You did mention, I'm hearing food come up a lot as far as driving behavior with food. I did want to touch on that, in that I'm a really big proponent that we don't always need to use food, that reptiles do show a lot of behavior without ever using food, especially if they've been allowed some agency to choose where they go and whatnot, which we don't tend to offer traditionally to reptiles. We kind of move them versus letting them move themselves. And I find when introducing new things, even if it's not food, a lot of times that in itself will drive exploratory behavior without ever needing to use food, or pairing items with food to where you're building interest in novel things that could potentially lead to food. I think one of the things that I see a lot of times with reptile care is we've really shortened the feeding process. Even if they smell food for a half hour before we prepare it, a lot of times we just give it to them. And then even if they have to look around their enclosure, maybe it's a 15 or 20-minute process. Whereas looking at wild species and how they interact in native habitats, that hunting process might take them a week. And how do we stretch that out to get all of those behaviors that they would do in the hunting process versus just the strike or the hunt or the in foraging behavior. And I think that's a really good way to start to get some more novel behavior and inspire more novel behavior, and probably fully utilize swapping enclosures, because they'll be using every part of that space versus, just certain spaces that they might find reinforcing. They might be more apt to explore new areas. Those would be, I guess, some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's an interesting component. This is part of what John had brought up here too, which is that we're talking about doing testing all the way through. And there's something that's been interesting, and it's not just within the zoo world. And John, being the world's leading expert on exhibit design for zoos, I'm going to point that out for anybody that is. John has been doing this for decades and decades, and it's amazing work that he's done. And John can tell you a little bit more about this, that traditionally, and it's not just in zoos, it's every environment, including what we do to ourselves. We don't tend to think about how we arrange environments for our behavior. We tend to put ourselves and our pets and our zoo animals and everything into environments that we've already designed, and then we deal with behavior as it happens. And that has been, I like to illustrate that has been, in the zoo world, that has been very much the rule, not the exception. So you will get the experts in, they will say, this is what this animal needs, this is what this animal does in the wild, this is what, these are all the things that are done. You have the people that are familiar with their captive exhibits typically, and they say, this is from my experience, what I've seen, what Sumatran tigers need when they're in a zoo. This is what they'll do. This is what you'll expect them to pace. And then you talk to the Sumatran tiger field biologists, if you can, and they say, this is what they do in the wild. And then you build an exhibit, and then you put 3 tigers that have never seen that exhibit into a multi-million-dollar exhibit, and it turns out they use maybe a fraction of that. And we do this with every, including us. I mean, we do this with our children. We do this with ourselves. It's like, hey, I'm just going to move into this house, and then turns out I do a lot of different things behaviorally in this house because the house wasn't built for my behavior. I adjust my behavior to the house. So we do these kind of things with all behavior. And this is part of what like what John and I have been talking about with how we can collect data throughout that entire process. And rather than take a lot of these things that may be assumptions where we say, well, this is how this animal responds to this, or this is what this animal needs. Okay, but what about the animal's choice? What about the operant behavior that they exhibit? What about the respondent behavior they exhibit? What about and even at an ethological level, even at the evolved mechanisms and how those affect their behavior, it's still not clear how those things end up emerging under these conditions. So rather than say, well, I've done this, I've done that, I know that this is what this animal needs, we want to treat those, I think, as choices and then things that can be tested. And that's a really important part. And I can't recommend that enough for dealing with all animal behavior, is that's why I constantly emphasize those are empirical questions, because we need the data.
One of the things that I've been reading and writing about recently is the idea of co-design with the animals. How do you get them to participate in the design process? And that's really through doing a lot of prototyping, but it's iterative. One of the problems we've had with behavioral assessment is they pick a methodology, and this is something Eduardo knows a lot more than I do, where everything has to be fixed for a certain amount of time and then you get the result. Well, okay, but you've lost all that time and you haven't tried other things. And so, if we can do prototyping where you just try some basic things and then see where that takes you and then try something else and kind of follow the animal's leads. Well, what did it do? What didn't it do? What did it prefer? Where was it seem most comfortable? And kind of take your prototypes down that way before you even build the exhibit. And
like exhibit preference testing, basically.
Yeah.
Finding out what they're going to use. And yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's, I'm very excited about what you guys are going to do. Can't wait to come see it.
But a lot of it
Like
depends on where we find the animals and what they'll help us with, because the prototyping probably has to be done before the project's built. There won't be any place for them there. So there's collaboration. Right. Please go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's really exciting the sizes you're talking about and the variety of microclimates that you can offer. And you could almost shape these different habitats to have different focuses. And this one could be more arboreal, this one could have more fossorial options. And in cycling, you could almost see what some of the preferences are. And then the next time you switch up the habitat, you could change it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to help you understand the concept more. Right now, I think we're looking at 3 of these larger ones that are interconnected, but they're interconnected with an overhead tunnel system where they can bypass, or it's not a through exhibit rotation, it's a bypass rotation. So the animal could just do the loop and come back to where it started. Or it could go into any one of those other ones. Obviously, they have to have a shift area where they can move out. Or maybe, one of them moves up to the tunnel, the other one, the tunnel is segmented. So one of them moves to this section, that frees up its exhibit, the other one moves into it. You see what I mean? So you have a circuit that's independent, and you can first of all train them or allow them to become comfortable in the circuit. So they always know how to get home. And then you can gradually introduce them. And then one of these exhibits is mostly water. One of them's mostly trees.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I want to go hang out in those exhibits. Those sound like fun exhibits for me to be in.
Well, I was going to add really quickly. There's another component that also, John, we've spent a bit of time talking about too with the design of this exhibit, which in getting at what you were saying, Peter, about hanging out there, there's the visitor component, which is also, and that's something that's not been done really in terms of designing exhibit with testing the visitor experience. So it's not just part of, I don't remember, John, if I mentioned this was something I started presenting on what I called empirically validated or empirically tested, empirically based exhibit design. Which that's the idea is like what you were mentioning, prototypes. So you come up with these ideas, and we started to do a little bit of that at Woodland Park Zoo before I finished up my fellowship there, where we were testing things before the actual design of the exhibit for the Sumatran tigers and the sun and sloth bears, even though the sun bears were not going to be there anymore. But then there's also the visitor experience, and how can you adjust what happens so it changes visitor behavior. And one of for the studies that I've done and the papers that I've written about animal visitor interactions and just human animal interactions in general, one of the key factors I talk about with that is treating visitor behavior like visitor behavior. So treating it like this is something that I can adjust for the purpose of, visitor welfare. So why am I talking about that any different than the way that I would talk about Sumatran tiger welfare? In that, if all we're going to do is hand them surveys, are we really getting as much as we can from knowing about what they do? Because at the end of the day, I mean, one of the studies that I published shows exactly that what people do is very different than what they say. So that was part of Andrea Godinez's thesis. at University of Washington in the museology program. So that's another important component that we want to get at, is how do we adjust the exhibits so that visitor behavior is accounted for as well, and therefore visitor welfare.
Well, I think one thing that is really huge, not like, I think from a zoo standpoint, it's more of a priority than it is necessarily for me, but it's a really nice thing that just kind of happens because of it, is that when we have animals who are exhibiting more behavior, we get more buy-in from the visitors, right? So a snake moving around an enclosure is viewed very differently than a snake with its head out of some leaves sitting there for hours on end, right? And so having a snake who's active and moving around and exhibiting natural behaviors is going to be really good for involving visitors into it. And training and you know, appropriate enrichment is a really huge part of that. And so I think when we're looking at, you know, my first thought was, when you said a 25-foot tall enclosure, my first thought was, heating that is hard. Now, granted, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, so heating's always a thing here. Heating that can be a little hard. But the other thing is I think that height is definitely more important to a lot of species than we give them credit for. And especially for Burmese, I think a Burmese python is going to be pretty climbing. Even they, you know, there's this concept that, oh, well, when they're young, as they get older, they stop climbing. I think part of the reason they stop climbing is because A, people don't give them the opportunity to climb, and B, they're too fat to climb and have no muscle, right? But also making sure that being lower down or in the visitor viewing area is reinforcing enough for them to actually be seen. And so making sure that I would be looking at either finding ways to ethically reinforce them for being in the right spot. And I'm sure these are all things that you've thought of and have done before. These are just what's rattling around in my head. But you know, because I wouldn't necessarily want an animal's only access to an arboreal's animal's only access to heat being on the ground, because then we're either going to see them basking in a place that they don't feel as comfortable, or not basking at all. Which are unhealthy things, obviously. So my thought was, okay, well, if we have a tall enclosure, we have an arboreal snake, and we want to make sure that it's feeling safe and where it wants to be, exhibiting natural behaviors and meeting its thermoregulation requirements, well, then maybe we need to move the visitor's access to a different spot, as opposed to having to stare up really high up to even see an animal. So those are the things that I was thinking about when we were talking about the enclosure size. And I think that would provide a lot of interesting buy-in too. And then the thing that I also just started thinking about is, because like I said, I'm always thinking about movement and whatnot. I was like, well, maybe if the snake is high up and the people have to climb stairs to get there, maybe people will be more active and start climbing and building their quad muscles. Like that's what I think. Like, let's improve the welfare of the visitors from a physiological standpoint too.
Yeah. So this is all, it's very cool, and I want to use this moment now as a segue to get at, because I know John, thank you very much. By the way, it's amazing having John here in general. I am fortunate enough to be able to help John with this project, and John has been one of my zoo heroes for the longest time. So some of my earliest zoo papers that I was reading was some of the papers John was publishing even back in the 80s about exhibit design, and just even seeing when Jane Ann gave me the tour of Louisville Zoo, and I was like, this is John's design. You know, when I got to work with Woodland Park Zoo, and I was, you know, out there looking at the Northwest trails and things like that, and saying this is all part of what John helped design. So it's
John, let's definitely exchange information, because I'm sure Carrie and I would like to talk to you about stuff.
Yeah,
we'll
we definitely afterwards we'll make sure we get emails back and forth. And
absolutely.
No, this is a great opportunity. Yeah, absolutely. One last thing I want to say is, as the discussion broadens, which is a good thing, you know, we're also talking about rotation and these other kinds of movement enrichment with, you know, with things like skinks or things like geckos,
Mhm.
not just big guys.
Yeah,
And
good.
so just kind of keep that in mind, that
Yeah.
we're planning at least two levels, one for the big guys, one for the kind of, well, smaller than the indigo snake, but maybe around here, a red-bellied black or something like that, that are native to our area. In fact, I have them in my backyard, but
I told Eddie, I said that when I come and visit you in Australia, you have to get me in front of a red belly black. I'm obsessed with them.
well, we have several copperheads in the garden I could probably introduce you to.
Please.
The red
Yes.
belly come through occasionally, not all the time.
That's what I was wondering too, John. Are you doing any sort of co-housing, cohabitating, or are you just looking mostly at housing in isolation?
No, I mean, all of those things are open. Absolutely. Yeah. We just need more research. And right now the ideas are all pretty general. And we're, trying to have flexibility so that we can try all of these different things. For sure. In my garden, I've got at least 4 free-ranging blue-tongue lizards, for example. And I'm amazed to see they love to co-house. They two of them or 3 of them will climb up into a tight little den that you wouldn't think is big enough for one.
Mm-hmm. Snakes do that too.
Yep.
There's a lot of, not even just the garter snakes. I know Lori's got a few cohab carpet pythons. One thing I really want to do is I think it would be really cool someday to cohab a Eastern indigo with a Florida gopher tortoise, because they inhabit the same burrows. I think that would be really cool. And I know there are some keepers who have large enclosures for their bigger pythons, and they keep like arboreal geckos in there. Like I know there's a guy who's got a great big Burmese python, and the snake has its own room in the house, and he's got like 5 or 6 free-ranging tokay geckos, and those are animals that the snake would not be interested in eating and are totally capable of getting places the snake would not be, as well. But yeah, I'm really interested in cohabitating. I think that would be, tortoises are often talked about animals that are extremely solitary, and Carrie and I have both experienced animals specific individuals who are very interested in participating in other species.
There's been a lot of good enrichment training done with tortoises too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've got 3 right now. We've got a leopard tortoise who's right there. And then we've got 2 baby pancake tortoises that are living together. And I'm really interested in, I'm working on a garter snake project too, where I want to train them to do like behaviors in tandem. So have basically both snakes do the same behavior. Kind of, I'm almost thinking of like in an aquarium where the dolphins will do jumps together. Not that exact thing, but that kind of thing where I want to train the snakes to do behaviors simultaneously, and contingent on the other snake doing the behavior as well, which I think would be really cool.
So I think, John, part of what you were referring to, Michael Kuba has published 2 or 3 papers now on some of the larger tortoises. I cannot pronounce their name. Aldabra. Thank you. Aldabra tortoises. He's published 2 or 3 papers now on some of the learning components of there. He did some target training with them, and then some learning related stuff. And then Nicole Dory and Lindsay Merkham have published a tortoise paper as well. I don't remember if it's Aldabra or another species that was down in Gainesville, that they did some preference stuff with initially. So there's some little bit of learning related papers that have been published with tortoises. Not much. One of the earliest learning related papers published with any turtle, unfortunately, is extremely aversive. So one of the published back in the 70s or so, that was the first learning related paper that I saw, that was all based on escape behavior with a turtle being used in turtle races. Not great. Similar with alligators, some of the first papers published on learning related stuff with the Mississippi alligator, the American alligator, right? So Mississippius was in the 60s in JAB, and it was all heat escape to get through mazes to water tanks. Yeah, yeah. And they actually had
you have to get an alligator.
that's how bad. So we're talking about a T maze with American alligators, and they had 8 of them. And what they did was they put pools on the end of the maze, and so they first tracked the learning route. So it's just a T maze. So it was like, okay, you choose one or the other side, and the alligators would then show a preference to get into to escape the heat to get into a pool, and then they reversed that side to show, what was how long did it take, the latency of learning at that time. And one of the alligators died in the process of that too. Not necessarily clear if it was because of all the heat aversion, but that probably didn't help.
Yeah.
So all of that said, I wanted this to be the segue, and I think, Peter, you're already doing it. You look like you were looking at questions. So let's have this be the segue to get into some questions that people have. This is a really great information. It's really it's pretty heavy that we jumped into right off the bat, and that's pretty nice. You want to tackle anything that people are asking here? I saw
Mara's got a good question. Mara asks, where do you suggest the newer snake or reptile owners start with training, targeting, or something else? Yeah, targeting. We just taught a whole class on this, Carrie. Do you want, Carrie? You take it. I'm always afraid of talking too much.
That's okay.
Welcome to my life.
So I think that when it comes to, there's a lot of things to consider when we're talking about a newer snake or reptile owner, right? In that, looking at their learning history, the trainer or owner's learning history, but also the learning history of that animal. And unfortunately, a lot of the times what we see and what we spent a lot of time, in the beginning of our snake training courses is looking at like Carrie was talking about earlier, just collecting data, like baseline data on how they behave normally, and then presenting novel stimuli at a really low level as not to get any stress behaviors. And a huge part of that data that I'm especially focused on, as all trainers are, is really understanding body language. And with snakes, it's not as intuitive as it is in some other species. And the other thing I found with snakes is that there's no, so like, let's say a snake arching, which is where we would call periscoping, where they come up and they have their head at kind of a more 90-degree angle and they look around, kind of like spy hopping in whales. Garter snakes do it all the time. It's stupid cute. It's adorable. But then we have this other behavior that sometimes they will do where they arch. So they rather than coming to this kind of 90-degree angle, they'll come to this arch. Now, we could say, okay, arch is like when they start to arch or they move really quickly and hold that arch position, we're looking at that being like a mild stress level, right? So they're like kind of being cautious of something, not necessarily something like terrible that you need to avoid all the time, but in general, that's something that we can associate with that, right? Well, but with snakes and all animals, but I've found especially in snakes, you have to look at the whole picture, right? So you need to look at everything else that is going on in the environment to figure out whether that behavior that you just saw is actually a behavior in response to an aversive stimulus, or if it's just a behavior that's happening without response to an aversive stimulus. So being really mindful of that. And then in terms of when we start looking at like more operant behavior, whereas and you do this, I reinforce with this, targeting is generally where we start out. But with snakes, the progression of our course goes data collection, right? Of figuring out what looks normal. Let's look at all the distant antecedents and the more immediate ones. And then we move to introducing novel stimuli, seeing how they behave around it. And then usually with snakes, we go on to puzzle feeding. So presenting food in different ways. One of the things that's really nice about that Carrie also mentioned too, is not only are we exposing them to novel stimuli and modifying that based on their response, but now we're also pairing food with novel stimuli in a puzzle feeding situation. So, and there's even more to it, right? We're now extending their hunting process that they're doing. So, you know, Carrie has videos and data that she's taken and that she can take, you know, versus the wiggle the rat in front of the snake, they strike, swallow, and that was their entire feeding process, where Carrie has been able to, with Mags, her Woma python, get, think to like an hour and a half or something.
Oh no, 2, 3, 4 hours.
2, 3 or 4 hour hunting processes. Now you're going to get a lot of behavior in that, not just, I mean, not just, okay, she's spending a lot of time hunting. She's also going to be smelling, climbing, digging, all of these other behaviors that we're looking at that are increasing in her behavioral repertoire to actually get that. Now that you're doing lots of puzzle feeding, you've extended their hunting time, you have all this new behavior. Well, now look at all this new behavior that we can then shape and turn into other behaviors, right? Trying to present a target to a snake who hasn't had a lot of exposure to novel stimuli, has lived in a tub its whole life, or lived in a small enclosure with very limited or no change to their environment other than when they were first put in it, or maybe during cleaning. Getting that animal to approach a target in order to make contact with it to make criteria is going to be much harder and a much slower process if they don't have that experience to start out with. So in general, that's where we take things, right? And just start a lot of data collection on terms of their response to other things. And that's even before I even consider presenting a target. Mara, does that?
I would also start.
Go for it.
Oh, Mara's here. Okay. I would also ask, I guess, where you're at with the reptile you're thinking of working with, because a lot of times my first step is actually just observing them from outside the habitat, and I want to start to get any sort of voluntary behavior. So it's a very first step after I've gotten some data might be just to open the door and read a book, or you know, do something that's pretty low key, where you're not necessarily asking them to interact with you, but you're still able to observe behavior based on a very small change to the environment. Sometimes even just opening that door, because it often means that we're going to reach in and do something, kind of I guess habituating that to where it's not such a big deal when that door opens. And if that door opens, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do something, but that they might get access to do something as well. And it's really a start to any other behavior, right? A lot of times, because our animals are not living most of the time with reptiles, they need a controlled environment, right? So they're not living with us like a dog or a cat. We have to go to them, right? We have to open that door. We have to start a session in some way. We need a visual way or some sort of cue to them that you're asking for that interaction. And so I guess we're going to go to a very beginning point. If we've already set up the habitat, we've started to get an idea of what their behavior is normal, we've started to observe them, then I guess that would be my start. And then, going into everything that Peter has already mentioned as far as starting to see how they interact with different things.
Well, and Carrie, also in talking about you know, opening the enclosure and presenting, one thing that we've also done is try to, I mean, sometimes we're looking at snakes who we never see unless we dig them out of the soil, right? And that is in general an abnormal behavior. And so sometimes we're working with snakes who have serious stress responses to us interacting with them. So that opening the door and making sure that we're like very unoffensive in our presence. And one of the ways that we've done that is, one, staying at a distance that's far enough away for them to feel comfortable. But also we'll do things when we're training, like put a table in front of the enclosure. So now we have even more space for them to not only stay at a distance, but in case they decide to come out of the enclosure, they're not going to drop onto the floor, right? So now we have a training space to work with until we're at a spot where, if we ever want to get to the spot, until we're at a spot where we want to maybe train that animal in a new place. Like either on a climbing gym or maybe outside or anything like that. So using that as an option to create as much distance as we need to, while reading that book, while watching that movie or anything like that. So yeah, I think that's a really good point as well.
And yeah, and that brings up a good point too, depending on what that reaction is to you opening that door. That might mean that you open it a very small amount. That might mean that you open it and then close it again. So that it's not always significant that it's being opened, but a lot of times really that's the first step in any training program, because we have to have a way to interact with them. And we've certainly done training with some animals, specifically like small crocodilians and water turtles and things, where you can get training on the outside of the habitat where you're not actually having to enter, but you still have to provide a reinforcer in some way. So you're going to need some type of access to that habitat. And a lot of times that means we're going into their space. And so, yeah, inviting them out. I like that Peter mentioned the table, inviting them out in some way, so that we're not always going in, but that they can come out and interact as well. Getting that first step is a great way to start to shape any sort of behavior.
Sure. And Carrie, you mentioned habituation as an important procedure here, which that in and of itself, I mean, if you're thinking about shaping behavior, that's already something that's so, it requires a number of preliminary steps that can be so difficult to get. And in a lot of contexts, it's part of the reason why, by the way, this is also part of the reason why target training ends up being so popular in zoos, is because a large part of target training is sign tracking or auto shaping, which is actually a Pavlovian or respondent conditioning procedure. But even prior to that, what's in the learning literature, what's called pseudo learning, is habituation and sensitization. And when we're talking about habituation, we're just talking about no longer responding with X in the presence of Y. So there's no actual associative procedure involved. It's not pairing, Y with some other stimuli. It is just, you are trying to either increase the response, sensitization, or decrease the response, habituation, to some stimulus itself. And if you have already an organism that's not familiar with people, that's a big, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about at that point is habituation. Once you've gotten through that process, I would strongly recommend going with simple respondent conditioning procedures, because they're necessary to get to that level of shaping for any organism. So that in and of itself, and then that's when, but offering those choices early is pretty cool too. So because there's operant behavior happening all the time, regardless of whether you're training it or not. So that's pretty cool too. So
I'd like to point out also that one thing I'm really hoping that changes in all sections of the animal keeping world. We talk about, and Carrie's very interested in developmental processes in reptiles. And one of those things for me is maybe let's make it so it's not so much the norm that we're actually getting an animal when we get an animal, that they've had this life experience of minimalistic keeping, of of lack of stimuli. So we're not starting at ground zero, right? And there are some people that are starting to do that. Pamela is here, and she is working on a breeding program with hognose snakes, plains, or also known as Western hognose snakes, and she's providing those babies with substrate and hides and all that kind of thing, which on the surface may seem basic, but it's not for a lot of the ways that these animals are typically kept and bred. And so it's so exciting to hear people, I'm like, well, when you have babies, let me know, because I would love to work with an animal who has had that, right? The same way I wouldn't want to get a puppy who had never left the whelping box, right? I would want a puppy who had had experiences with other dogs, was at an appropriate age, all that sort of thing, and had experienced lots of different things. That's just going to be better for the developmental stages, but also just for my ability as a trainer and as a keeper to provide good animal welfare for that animal once they are in my care. And I'm really hoping and starting to see some change in the way things are being done.
Yeah, it's pretty, I think something that's really easy to forget when we see some of the amazing work that's now starting to happen in zoos and aquariums with training procedures is that almost every one of those animals, to the point where you can almost assume, but almost every one of those animals has grown up with keepers, has been around keepers its entire life. It's under those conditions from this is of course species dependent, but this is still almost the case for all animals. There's not very many animals that are being wild caught and brought into a zoo these days. It's almost all in-house for breeding, and then setting them up on species survival plans to be sent to another place so they breed, and we have these genetically viable programs. So there's a lot more. That all said, there's a lot more releasing than there is. So there's a lot more going out than there is going in. So promotion of conservation programs and the like. But it's pretty amazing to see. Historically, there's a lot of stuff, especially in the ethological literature, about dealing with things like sensitive periods, sensitive learning periods, and there was a lot of interest. Especially, going back to the three original ethologists, von Frisch, Lorenz, and Tinbergen, that they were interested in some of these developmental processes that were happening and how that affected learning. So they were interested in those proximate causes of behavior and how those were affected developmentally. So it was really cool to see. That's where we got ideas of imprinting and things like that. There are extremely important periods of time. And if we're just talking, even if you want to take a purely behavior analytic perspective from it, I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to take a purely let's only think about this in terms of learning and general process theory, then still there's a long learning history then. Early on, that you've just made it much more difficult for later learning. So all of every regardless of the spin we take on this, it all says start working with those animals as early as you can, and getting them used to being around you, because then you can get to that point of being able and target training, great, fantastic, and then shaping all these things that you can get to be able to do with these animals are only possible because they're not absolutely terrified of you to begin with, which requires a proper social experience. So
and finding when that time is appropriate too, right? So in the parrot world, and I'm hoping to see a change in this. We are seeing babies, like eggs being hatched in incubators, and they're never having contact with their parents. And right. We are seeing, we see then when we look at birds that were raised by their parents, at least initially for roughly the first 4 weeks is usually what seems to be ideal, or never hand raised at all, we can still see a lot of really beautiful and healthy behavior out of those animals. I think we would see less self-destructive behaviors in parrots if we gave them more of an opportunity to actually learn how to be more like a bird. So it's not even just let's get in there as early as we can, it's let's get in there appropriately, and start out on the right foot whenever possible.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, when you look at the citizens and and there's so little research on this, yet there are tons of assumptions that are made when people look at the, the auto grooming, the allo grooming, so that the feather plucking, I'm using primatology terms to describe citizen behavior now, but some of the excessive feather plucking that you get, a lot of that seems to be socially mediated. And in some cases, difficulties with those social experiences. I mentioned the primate stuff, and the reason why I was talking about that is because one of the first people really doing a lot of intensive look at primate behavior and social behavior of primates and the importance of some of those developmental experiences was Harry Harlow. And Harlow he wasn't calling these stereotypies at that time. He wasn't, if you go back and you read some of his old papers, he wasn't even giving you the genus and species of the rhesus macaques he was working with. But Swami and Harlow and the work that they did was really, really important for first helping to, now it led to a lot of what psychology then took on as attachment theory, which I'm not a terribly big fan of, but I'll leave that at that. But in terms of the learning and importance of development and early social experience, there's a lot of really cool stuff there. And when you see people, they will talk about things like stereotypies and negate the experience of the organism and how that learning is relevant towards that behavior. Instead, they want to treat this necessarily as if, well, I'm just going to treat this as, here's a screwed up animal, it's crazy, and it's going crazy because of its environment. And it's like, wait, that is so not scientific. How do we look at that in a way that we know what variables are relevant toward the behavior, and what does that mean in terms of the organism and their learning history? So what does that tell us from that perspective? So yeah, let's go on to other questions.
Lori is next here. I could very easily talk myself out of it being okay to keep snakes and other reptiles under captive management because we have to limit opportunities out of necessity. How do you think welfare science can determine when it is acceptable to limit behavior and when it is not? I think that the most the person who should take the head on this would be Eddie. He's only like a welfare scientist.
Right. It mentioned because Lori mentioned welfare science. That's why you're like, oh boy.
Eddie.
So I want to give a really short answer because I don't want to detract so much from the reptile focus. So what I will say is simply this, that what we call welfare science is not always very clear. It's a very fluid thing. Like even what we have decided is improved welfare is very fluid. It is context dependent. It is because we're talking about behavior, and all of behavior is context dependent. So if you want to say increasing activity is a positive welfare indice, really? Is it a positive welfare indice for a lion, who's supposed to sleep, 16 hours a day, 20 hours a day? And we've got them now like entire exhibit time. They're just running around. Is that a positive welfare index, that in and of itself? And if you were just looking for activity, well, okay, give every visitor that shows up to the zoo just a bunch of rubber bands and they can just sit there and flick them at all the penguins. The penguins are going to move, right? Hey, look at that. I just got penguins being more active. So these things are very context dependent. I tend to think about behavior, and you know, Izzy Gold Diamond and Joe Lang talks a lot about this as well. And he's the one that really has, Joe Lang has made a lot of uh, Gold Diamond's work more directly relevant, I think, for applied animal behaviors. In terms of thinking about behavioral choice, behavioral freedom, and restriction. So behavioral restriction. So what I like to say is we need to be as least restrictive as possible. This is a concept behavior analysts have been using for several decades now, is this principle of least restrictiveness. And that's how I determine the ethics of any procedure in terms of its welfare merit. So when you start restricting behavior, you're offering less choice, you're offering less behavioral freedom. We can actually use the term behavioral freedom in a very deterministic fashion, which is kind of ironic. But it's still very much, I mean, this is a behavior analytic concept of freedom. So that's what I would say is we have to be careful about what we're doing in terms of restricting behavior. But if you're talking about, you know, that's look at the overall restriction for welfare, take the context into play, and then we need good quantitative systematic data more so than anything. And I say this all the time. We need to know how behavior is changing from some level to the next. So we need to be able to assess that in some way. I know that's not always possible, but the more you can do that in any way, the better. Any data is better than no data. So that's we use data, and hopefully we use less restrictiveness in our procedures. And if you have to restrict some behavior from occurring or not occurring, take that into think about the context under which that occurs. So is it better to leave that environment out as an option? You know, so if we're talking about, well, you know, I can't let my kid into the kitchen. I'm going to end on this really weird example. I can't let my kid into the kitchen because he's going to touch all the hot plates and burn himself, right? He's going to touch everything. He's going to go touch the oven, touch the top of the stove. Okay, why is your kid in the kitchen to begin with? So those are the kind of things that I think, well, can you offer another option than the kitchen so that behavior is still not overall restrictive, but you have restricted the ability to engage in those behaviors in that context? So that's the way I like to think about it from a welfare perspective. And it gives it that fluidity that welfare science necessarily needs.
And as we go forward, I think that we're going to have more and more answers on that in regards to reptiles based on the more data we have. And so I think when we're looking at, we've got a lot more data on dogs to do that with than we do with snakes. And the thing with snakes too is that there's also like thousands of species of snakes. So now we have to like narrow that down even more.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's especially hard with a lot of exotics, especially reptiles.
Although I will say this, and this is a little bit of the cynic in me though too, with dogs, even with dogs, I think there are far more people that want to say that this is just the way something is, or want to be perceived as the expert, rather than be willing to suggest that there may not be an answer to that question, or that even if there is an answer, that answer may be context dependent. So I find I don't know what's going to happen when I think the older I get, the less I know is what I'm starting to find out. So
Scale.
yeah. So and that's part of why I become more and more reliant on data in and of itself, because I'm unwilling to say definitive things about how this works, particularly for behavior, which is all functionally dependent. So I think even with dogs, where we have, you know, especially in the past couple decades, so much research coming out about aspects relevant to the applied relevant research on dogs, there's still so much that you see people saying that they demand this is the way it should be, sometimes in the face of actual data and what that data says. So I often distrust quote unquote experts.
I don't even like the word. Carrie, do you want to take the next question from Chanda? I can read it.
Donna Quixote, what an adorable name. That is her
Yeah.
bearded dragon's name, Donna Quixote.
Okay, so Chanda says, I have a bearded dragon, Donna Quixote, which I love as well, who I've had for about 2 months. I've successfully target trained her to a target stick. She has become comfortable with my hands in her enclosure and near her. I'm not sure how to start voluntarily handling her, as I don't want to confuse my the presence of my hands with the presence of the food target stick. I have searched the Facebook group because I was told I'd find details on there, but I did not find anything specific. So I'd love to hear more from all of you regarding how to approach handling. I love the idea of rotating enclosures for enrichment. What zoo is that? And I think J.R. Henderson answered that, which was Louisville Zoo.
Yep.
One thing that might be important is how your enclosure opens. If it's from the front or the top, that might affect where you need to start in that process. As far as getting that discrimination between your hand and the target stick, I find reptiles to pick up on pairings really quickly and to discriminate pretty easily. In those first couple of repetitions, you might see some generalization. If all they've done is target, and now you're giving them your hand, they might think you're generalizing that to be the target, or whatever the case might be. Not to say that we know what they're thinking, but they might be anticipating a target, and so you might get behavior that you would associate with a target. I tend to use shift stations and boxes a lot personally with reptiles, so asking them to go to a specific spot. If I'm going to look for consent behavior or consent to be handled, asking them to go to a specific spot or to a shift box of some sort. I know Peter's done some work with their bearded dragon Credence, where they had them jump into a Tupperware type container, and that worked out really well.
That was especially helpful when it was top entering enclosure, because I put it in there, he could jump into it, and then now he's in an open front, so I can kind of open it and show him my hands, and he'll come out that way.
With front opening, a lot of times the opportunity to access coming out and going to a different space, or just even the curiosity of seeing what's outside, can be enough of a motivator for them to come towards you or want to come out onto your hand. If you're working without a front opening, with some of these other type of enclosures that we have, sometimes we have to get a little bit more creative to make that a safe option, and also an option they're motivated to do. So we're looking at getting a voluntary behavior. Why would they want to do that? What's in it for them? What would be the reinforcement? It doesn't have to be food. Sometimes I think we're a little bit nervous to pair food with handling. I don't think we need to be as nervous as we are, but I understand where that trepidation comes from. With this whole idea of feeding response and feeding mode in reptiles, which I personally take some issue with, but I don't have enough data to fully deal with, take apart yet. But this idea that there's some sort of mental shift, which we tend to see somehow almost predominantly in captivity and not in the wild, is really interesting to me. But this idea that we somehow stop the thinking process when we introduce food, I think we need to start to really look at that with reptiles in human care, if that's actually something that's going on, or is it something that we are shaping through what we are introducing to them, through the different stimuli we are introducing to them, the way that we introduce food, the environment that we introduce food in. So I don't think we necessarily have to separate it, but I would look at how you can make it inviting, how you can make it reinforcing. So you can certainly use your target to shape a shifting behavior or behavior where you're asking them to move to a certain place, where you would then invite them out. You could ask them to shift into a box, where you then take the box out. So if they don't get in the box, you don't take the box out, obviously, right? So they have a consent behavior there that they could offer to say yes or no. Basically, you're giving them a way to opt out, to say no or yes to that
There's
healing.
video of that in the group of me doing that with Credence.
There-
I'm jumping in the box.
What you're actually, this is great, because in this case you're actually talking about stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination here. So you are in fact talking about a level of stimulus control, which is great, because a lot of times this topic can be confused a little bit. But so you are talking about wanting to make sure that they distinguish between food, your hand and this target stick, that your hand does not equal time for food and the target stick does, correct? Right? So this is what we're talking about. So, and one of the interesting things that can happen is that you can actually have a potential pairing that becomes problematic, in that if your hand is presenting the target itself, is your hand being paired with the target, which is being paired with food? I actually ran into that problem with a ring-tailed lemur that I was target training a number of years ago. And if ring-tailed lemurs are really interesting to work with in general, because they're, well, I've never met one that's even like the other, so I don't know what to say, but they're all crazy. So that's my very specific scientific description of ring-tailed lemurs, is they're all crazy. No, but they're really interesting. And I ran into the problem of this particular female, and this was a female lemur that was starting to go a near pubescent, starting to go through puberty female. So it got really that it's probably not, it's a really odd case in and of itself. And my hand even just presenting the target on the enclosure was creating problems. So I had to make sure that it was easily discriminable. I increased the ability to make sure that the stimulus was discriminable, so that the target itself obtained stimulus control while my hand was still considered separate. And the simple way that I did that, I tied a string to the target. So my hand wasn't even anywhere. My hand would just pull the string and then bring the target back down, pull the string, bring. So my hand was never directly paired with the target. And because she was aggressing towards me while I was presenting the target, I should be clear. She was even trying to throw stink at me, which is something you'll get in ring-tailed lemurs. Yeah, that's whether that's possible, I don't know. Peter and Carrie are going to know a lot more. I just wanted to be clear about some of the distinction between and how we're describing that with behavioral terminology in terms of stimulus control. And in this case, specifically about whether you're getting generalization or proper stimulus discrimination in this case.
I see you, John. Let me say one thing real quick before, if that's okay. Chanda says again, front opening enclosure. She moves towards the target stick, but she attacks the food tongs when I present them after she moves towards the target. I don't want my hand attacked like the tongs. Yeah, no, I totally hear that. I think one thing though is that I have used target training and reinforcing with food on tongs with Credence, my bearded dragon, Dana's bearded dragon specifically, to get him onto my hands. And I haven't had a problem with him attacking my hands. The worst I've gotten from him was, and this is a slightly older dragon, but he had a lot of excitement around food, because when I got him, a live food at least, I don't think he had ever seen a live bug before. And the first time I saw him, he like leapt a foot in the air, showed it to him. I haven't had a problem with that. The most I've had is him licking my hand. And I also tend to not handle the food with my hands. When I'm handling him, I will only use with bugs at least. He is very, very good about eating his greens out of my hands. I don't have a problem with that. But that's the other thing too, is you can actually, he's 2 months old, your kiddo, so he's still probably eating, or she's still probably eating mostly bugs right now. She should be eating some veggies and stuff, but what you could do is you could actually use the veggies, which oftentimes don't necessarily elicit the same response, right? So if I'm working with a bird who, or an animal in general, but birds is where my brain goes to. If I'm working with a bird who gets super excited about pine nuts, I might start offering walnuts that are not their preferred item, but they'll still eat. And then I get a little bit more predictable behavior out of them when I'm asking for a behavior. And I think to touch on to what Carrie's talking about in terms of like this concept of, I also really like what she said too about like, they're actually pretty good at discriminating. And I think part of the concern around that has to do with the fact that we kind of view reptiles as different, right? So I don't think people don't necessarily like it, but I don't think people really seem to be as concerned in general, not you specifically, Chanda, but in general, be concerned about a dog mouthing them when they take a treat. But this concept of well, a snake just bit you or something like that somehow is very different, and how is this really scary, like big thing, which I'm not saying it's okay to get bitten. I'm just saying that this is a behavior that we see in lots of other animals, but for sometimes when we look at them in reptiles, we seem to attribute it to this like feed mode, right? Where now they're no longer present. Whereas when I'm training a dog and I get mouthed by a dog, or they like bite down a little too hard when I'm offering them a treat out of my hand, somehow that's just them wanting food. But for a reptile, it's like they're in this feed mode and their brain shut off and blah, blah, blah. So I think that's one thing to point on that. Carrie, did you have something to say? And then I wanted to ask John because he has a question.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if I'm getting a fixation on a certain object associated with feeding, whether that's tongues or hands or whatever it is, a lot of times I will try to redirect that. So I wouldn't necessarily be worrying so much that they're gonna associate your hand as being the tongs. However, your hands, like Eddie mentioned, your hands are holding the tongs. So if you have where they're basically looking out for food, right? So if you're getting the target, they've built that association, they see the target, they know the food is coming. The food is always coming from this direction. It's always coming in this way. I might look at offering food from a different direction, from a different place, tossing the food. I like the idea of using some of the vegetation or other things they might be eating. But can you offer it somewhere else? Can you offer it on a station on the ground? So you leave the food, right? So that they're starting to not necessarily always expect it in the same direction that your hands are going to come from for handling, right? So that you're building this association. This is where food comes from. This is the these are the conditions it comes in. This is the contingency. But if it may not necessarily be, if you take the target out, that they still don't necessarily think that food is coming from that direction. So that might be something to look at too, is offering food in different ways and from different places. I know with snakes that do have maybe a history of striking or being really fixated on food, or even a range of other behavior problems, introducing puzzle feeding or other ways to forage and get food, and it's sort of changing what that feeding process looks like, what that feeding pattern looks like, the behaviors associated with getting food, widening what those look like, seems to really affect a lot of behavior, not just associated around the feeding process, but around everything. So that might be something to look at too.
Yeah, there's some interesting related issues with goal
I
track.
just wanted to, I have to leave.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So I just wanted to thank everybody for your input and this really interesting show, and say goodbye until next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It'll be
Thank
recorded.
you.
You can always watch it. It was so nice to meet you. We'll be in
Thanks,
contact.
John.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Yeah. So there's some interesting issues with sign tracking and goal tracking in relation to this too, and that's in part of the associations that are made. So we're talking, but honestly, at this point, I think one of the most relevant components, and I'm talking about in general, like from a general behavior perspective, because I have zero experience with bearded dragons, other than petting one here or there. So I am talking about a general behavioral perspective. It's increase the discriminability in this case. So make it more, try to increase as much as you can, the distinction between this is what produces food and hand alone does not. That's what I mean by discriminability. And if that means you got to put a glove on every time you handle the tongs and you have food, and then if the glove's not on, there's never food. That's one way to increase discriminability. You can fade those things so that you get more specific stimulus control eventually to the tongs. So don't worry about, well, but I don't want that to always be the case. Okay, that's fine. You can fade in and fade out stimuli, but it may be that you need to start off with as high discriminability as possible, which in the case, the example that I used with the ring-tailed lemur meant not even having my hand ever touch the stimulus that I was using as a target. Cool.
The only name I have for you is J.R. Henderson, so I'm just gonna keep saying the whole thing.
That's
I think it's great. Sounds like Carrie, it sounds like JR wants the full 2 to 3 hour video of Mags and Peter Jackson flick. So let's pick a big Google Drive file, but I feel like you could probably do it. Then let me see. Kinsey says
does some really cool things with cats. Trick training and consent training with cats.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that, Shonda. Good. I'm glad you have some training plans. That's great. Kinsey says, when target training with snakes in the beginning, are you rewarding with a food item? Some of our snakes are only fed once a week. So I'm wondering if in that case, target training would only happen once a week. And then after that, JR used buttressing as a really awesome word. Or buttressing, I forget how to say it. Off Kinsey's question, what are generally the most effective secondary reinforcers for snakes? So Carrie and I are really big into non-food reinforcers, but that doesn't mean I don't use food. One thing that we push a lot is to make sure that when we are using food, we do not change the quantity or frequency of their feeding just for the sake of training. Right? So if we are not getting behavior that we want, we don't starve them in order to get the behavior we want. We also don't overfeed them so that we have a longer training session, right? Our goal is obviously the health of our animals. And so we want to be really mindful of that while still using, still sometimes using food as our reinforcer. So one thing that we've done, and there's a study that went out and did this, and that we've also done ourselves a lot, is I will actually cut up food items for snakes and use for multiple reps. So for my Eastern Indigo snake, Bruce, we did the most I think we ever did was 22 reps in one training session. Now that is not the case with my carpet python. The most reps I've ever done with him is 5. Partially, he's very young, and second off, it takes him a very long time to eat. I will often fold laundry in between reps with him. So we'll target, and then I feed him, and then I fold half my laundry because it will take him 5 to 10 minutes to actually eat the food item. He's just a really slow eater, whereas Bruce goes and it's gone. But even though I cut up the pieces of Bruce and could get 24 pieces into him, he's still eating the same amount of food in total as is appropriate for him, his age, and his physiological health, right? Now, that being said, I don't always feed him small multiple food items. I will sometimes give him a larger meal. For indigo snakes, multiple small meals is really common, and they eat a large variety of species. So I feed everything from quail, chicks, Reptile-Lynx is a product that's basically like sausages for snakes, mice, rats, He's eaten egg before, or eggs before. He likes to break them and lap them up, which is always super fun to clean. But anything for my little guy. So
all raw diet.
Huh?
I said all raw diet.
Yeah, all raw diet. Yeah. So for him, it's really easy to work with him in terms of that. That being said, I don't actually only need to use food for him. He works really well for anything he's never seen before. Or anything that's been a while since he's seen it. So I can reinforce him for targeting with a new box he's never seen. Like for instance, his enclosure right now is over the pandemic, I developed, I believe it's called retail therapy problems. And so I have lots of boxes that I use, and it's great for the snakes. So his enclosure is full of boxes right now, and he loves them, he uses them all the time. And spends a lot of time with them, and I can target him and then toss a box for him, and he will spend a few minutes or some time interacting with the box and then reset and look at me. Okay, time to target again. I'll remove the box, target him, and then give him another box as reinforcer, right? So boxes are one we go to a lot as far as non-food reinforcers. The other thing before I start talking about that is that snakes are pretty good learners, and even training once a week, or in the case of Bruce, twice a month, they learn very, very well, very, very quickly. And I haven't seen, and Carrie hasn't either, a real issue with training sessions being that far apart, even if we only get 1 rep or 2 reps per training session. They learn very quickly, and that's great. In terms of non-food reinforcers, go back to what we were talking about earlier. When we're first looking at them, we will have our students present options to find out what they like, right? So a container, this kind of container, that kind of container, a clear plastic container versus a cardboard box, crumpled paper, some leaves, different branches, a ball large enough that they can't swallow to push around in the case of snakes, different barks, textures, smells. I've done, we have at our house, we have a couple Great Pyrenees crosses, and they live outside. Well, sometimes they live outside, and they will sometimes get kind of almost like dreadlocks in their fur. And so when we groom those out, I will actually offer those to the reptiles, and that totally can function as a reinforcer because it smells all sorts of ways. I've used bedding from other animals, being mindful of biosecurity, of course, sheds from other animals. All of those things can be really valuable, but going back to when we start training, that observation standpoint is really, and that data collection standpoint is really important. And that's how we're going to find out what we can use to reinforce them based on what they spend the most time interacting with. Hopefully that's a clear answer to that.
Yeah, definitely don't overlook olfactory and temperature when introducing different objects. So a lot of times, because we have biases as humans, right? So visual things. Everybody. We often look at how things look or how they feel, right? And textures are important. And snakes, for whatever reason, really like soft, fluffy things a lot of times. But also looking at what it smells like and what it feels like temperature wise, right? So we might introduce something that's cold or warm, and that might not be as interesting as vice versa. So looking at that, as well as we can actually introduce smells to objects as well. So we've got dog zoomies going on right now.
Oh, Bam Bam.
We've had students that use literally a piece of cardboard, rub a frozen rat on it, and that becomes a really interesting reinforcer, and it's literally a piece of cardboard. So if we look at it as a human, we go, oh, that's really boring, that's just a piece of cardboard. But we've now introduced a scent, and it becomes more interesting. So a lot of times it's not necessarily having a whole shelves and shelves of novel objects, but we can make them novel based on what we do to them before we introduce them. It's important to look at too. And then looking at too, that a lot of times with snakes, looking at how long that foraging process is. I mean, there's snakes that might look for a hunting spot and then sit in ambush for a week waiting for that mouse to come by. And how often are we able to fully engage that behavior in a captive snake, right? So even if our active training is once a week, we're looking at an animal that might spend have a burst of behavior, and while they are maybe not moving, there's still behavior going on. So basically, I have never seen, like Peter mentioned, a loss of training or loss of behavior, even going 2 or 3 weeks or a month between training sessions. I never see a loss of behavior with that, and maybe that's because they naturally have a less infrequent feeding schedule. Maybe that's because of whatever reason, but I have not seen that to be an issue. I think it's more an issue for us as being impatient. We want to get that next repetition, right? So we have a session go poorly with our dog or a bird. We go, oh, okay, well, we can reshape it and we can come back the next day or even later in the day, right? Whereas with the snake, we might have to wait longer. And a lot of times it's more an issue of our patience and having to not push for more in a training session than we can get and be successful, right? Because, oh, I'm not going to get another chance for a while, or trying to do it too frequently. And yeah, we don't want to necessarily give more food than they need. So yeah.
There's I think another couple of questions, but I want to add to there was a question that kind of followed up with it. I think Evie says, I wonder, as with a very timid animal, I wonder if that would be detrimental. I have a ball python who is very curious but also timid and might find it stressful. So that's totally possible. Super important that you present everything at a level low enough that they are okay with it, right? So we're not suggesting having a snake who is timid filling their enclosure with boxes, right? We're not looking at that at all, right? We would want to start very, very small, evaluate their behavior, take some data, right? Be mindful, okay, well, they didn't really want to interact with that box. What can we change about the box to increase that? Can we try a different kind of box? Was the box too close? Right? So this is not something we would just throw on them all at one point. We would start nice and slow, especially because we often are working with a lot of animals who are very timid. Yeah.
Yeah, Evie, just to add to that, I was looking at that question. You're asking that too. All behavior is context dependent, right? And when we define behavioral function, we define it in terms of the effect on behavior. So when we define something as a reinforcer or a punisher, that's defined based on the effect it has on behavior, future occurrence of that behavior. So we don't sit there and look at something, say, well, candy's a reinforcer. Well, you don't know candy's a reinforcer until you see a kid willing to work to get candy, right? So you could give me black licorice, and if you started handing me black licorice for whatever thing I was doing, I will most likely stop doing that thing, right? Because black licorice is evil. It's terrible.
I would just start vomiting. So
yeah. So and that one's static, but otherwise this is all very context dependent. So definitely pay attention to the animal itself, always the individual. That's exactly what I was describing about in terms of welfare science. All of it is context dependent and individualized and fluid. It has to be. That's how behavior works.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Evie. Introducing something small like a fake flower and then observe is exactly what we would talk about. And I would put it at the side of the enclosure that they are not on.
Yeah, and even sometimes maybe outside the enclosure, definitely not near any resources that they would need to have access to. So yeah, trying to find it make it as least stressful or stress inducing as possible. Which a lot of times includes distance, right? How far can we get that object away from them where they notice it, but they're not scared of it?
Jasmine. Hi, Jasmine. I miss seeing you guys every week. Jasmine was just in our class. Asks, how long a reset period do you recommend for an incorrect or undesirable target behaviors? It's our favorite response. It depends. It, as I generally try and use in terms of the amount of time that I would, and the amount of time that I would withhold a reinforcer, I try to keep it as small as possible. And my goal too is then use that as information as how do I present this differently. Rather than it really depends. So if I've got for Bruce, I can move really quickly, and he will kind of realize when what he just didn't work. I can move to the next thing really quickly, or present whatever it is at a lower to get that to get the correct behavior or the behavior that meets criteria. But in general, I'm a pretty conservative trainer in that I don't ask for really big jumps very quickly unless I know the animal really well. And so I will ask for really small approximations to try and create as much successful repetitions as we possibly can. But that being said, it still does happen. And it kind of depends on what, like if I have a flow chart, then I would figure that out, right? I would say, okay, now I wait 5 seconds or now I wait 3 seconds. It just kind of depends. It also depends on the behavior. If I'm looking for a snake to move into a crate and they bypass the crate, I'm probably going to immediately try and get them back into it. In terms of like either moving the crate or retargeting them into a better position for it, versus if it's like an actual target, like that I'm holding in front of them and they either they like don't touch it or they strike at it, I would probably relatively quickly remove, wait a beat, and then put back in. So I'm not necessarily sitting here being, okay, now I need to wait for 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Unless I'm taking very specific data. I hope that's...
So let's be clear though, because you mentioned this about how long of a reset period, and you're referring to this as a reset for engaging in incorrect behavior. So if an organism engages in an incorrect or undesirable response, and you are changing the contingent, you are applying a contingency that removes them from the ability to obtain reinforcement for that period of time, and it's then leading to a decrease in the, I mean, that's the purpose, right? Is to decrease the occurrence of those responses. And so you are then seeing a decrease in those responses. That is negative punishment. That is defined. That's what defines timeout. So, and that's fine. Like, this is one of the things that we need to be clear about. If we are using, like, first off, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. This is part of the problem with using terms like the least reinforcing stimulus or situation, the LRS, right? Is they want to disguise the fact that they are using negative punishment when the procedure is in many cases meant to decrease some response while it's at least part of the treatment package. It's a timeout. Part of the treatment package is timeout. So just be clear that that's what you're doing, is you are in fact using a timeout to decrease some undesired response. So you're using negative punishment. Does that mean it's wrong? No. And that's one of the things we need to get over is, I mean, I use timeouts all the time on, with all kinds of behavior, definitely with student behavior. I use lots of timeouts. So I use timeouts in conversation.
I try to find, when I find myself using timeouts too frequently in a training session, I usually try and take that as some information for me to like take a step back and figure out what I'm doing that I can change.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing to consider. You say in this instance, I was trying to target train with food as the motivator, and then and they struck the target. So there's a few different ways to respond. You can, okay. My hand is the target. I'm miming again. You've seen this before, Jasmine and Lori, for sure. So we've got target, snake. Snake goes bam. You can either leave the target there, wait for a better response, tongue flick, reinforce. You can reinforce the strike if you wanted to, which I don't do often. It's usually something I would do in the very early. Oh, hi, other Jasmine's friend. Okay, sorry, I'm distracted. The other option would be to, I get strike, I move target away. Don't reinforce, present target, then I get. So there's a couple of different options. In terms of the amount of time that I would remove that target, I don't usually wait. If I do decide to remove the target, I don't wait that long. I usually wait for them to get into a response or go into a position where it doesn't look like they're ready to strike again. And I oftentimes will actually end up presenting the target further away after I strike. Because what I then get is they will, if they are going to do it, right? They move forward. So, okay, I got to strike here, they're here. So I'm not going to present this here because they're already there to start it again. So if I present it here, now they have to stretch out. If a snake's neck is straight and long, they can't strike. So that's what I use as one of my criteria for targeting or reinforcement, right? Is I want a long neck. They can't possibly strike if their neck is, they have to recoil to do it, right? So if I can reinforce for this long neck, then that's what I will do. So that's how I usually respond to it. But in terms of amount of time that I would withhold reinforcement or wait to re-cue, it's generally not very long. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would depend on what I first saw as the reason I got that behavior. And then if it's like the first couple times I've introduced a target and I'm getting a striking, I might not even remove it. I might just leave it there and let them interact with it and get used to it. And then come back in and start the session again. If I've been getting targeting behavior consistently and all of a sudden I'm getting a strike, I'm gonna look at why am I getting that strike. I would say I use redirecting more than I use timeouts. But sometimes
Can you give an example of what redirecting would look like, Carrie?
Yeah. So I might introduce a box or even just food itself to get their attention away from the target, to get a different behavior, whether that's moving to a different part of the habitat or just looking in a different direction. And then I can remove the target and reset in whatever way that I see would be more successful the next time. Sometimes I just will stop a session if I'm not sure where to go with it and come back. So I might leave a puzzle or something for them to do and reassess what's going on and come back into the session. I find snakes to learn really, really quickly. So I try to have a really clear picture of what I'm doing when I go into, which is good with any species, but I find a really steep learning curve with snakes because they just seem to build associations really, really quickly, not to other them in any way, but just what I've noticed.
Does that answer your question, Jasmine? Cool.
Cool.
Yeah, so we've probably got time for like another one or two questions. And
so we've got a Joseph question. Joseph's question is, what do y'all think about snake racks or tubs?
that might be the last question. I was gonna say that one's probably a lot. I
think I can answer it relatively quickly. My thought about, so it's kind of a hot button question, right? I think there's a few, okay, first I'll say why I'm not into tubs or into rack systems. So now when I hear the word tubs or racks, what I usually associate that with is, and so let's clarify descriptions.
Define our terms.
Define our terms. Thank you. What would I do without you, Carrie? Probably not much. So basically, it looks like a shelving unit. They've got Rubbermaids that the animal is inside of, and then the Rubbermaids pull in and out, or the containers pull in and out, and that's where the animal is. So that is not what I would generally consider to be best welfare keeping. Few reasons. One, traditionally it's done very minimalistically. So they don't have loose substrate, so it's usually paper towels, and then they have a water bowl, right? Heating is usually done through heat mats, which if you were here earlier when I was talking to John, do not provide the correct wavelengths of heat for proper digestion and muscle penetration. They are typically not large enough for the animal to fully extend, not just rectilinearly, but arboreally. So I've seen a number of snakes in racks that were so low that they literally couldn't lift their head up to the height that they could, right? So periscoping is not a behavior that it could exhibit. So we're looking at really minimizing the animal's behavioral repertoire. Also, lighting basically doesn't happen in them, because if it's in a shelf, how are you going to put lights access? So they're not going to be having necessarily lighting at all. You can have clear sides, so they would have more lighting in them, but you're certainly not going to be able to provide UV lighting or wavelengths of lighting that are going to be appropriate for them to be able to see. And without that type of lighting, you're partially blinding them in terms of what's available. Now, there are approximations that can be made, right? So for instance, Pamela uses a rack system on some level for some of her snakes, but she provides hides, water bowls large enough for them to climb into, substrate. I think she also put some leaves and stuff in there. So it's not a bare minimalistic setup in terms of its paper towel and a water bowl, right? So there's that. So there are approximations that can be made. I think one of the things why we get, and I tend to be, I'm the director of media, right? So, and for Reptelligence, so if someone's gonna say some interesting things about what we're doing, it's usually me that gets to handle it. On Instagram, at least. And I think some of the pushbacks in terms of, there's a paper about spatial considerations in snakes, is that we're looking at a lot of times for people who have racks and tubs, one of the benefits of them for people is that they use a very small, you can have 500 snakes in a single room. Right? Because the enclosures are not that large, they're provided with heat, they can feed, it's easy to clean, all that kind of thing. Now, let's say, okay, I've got 500 snakes and now they all need to be able to stretch out in their enclosure. No one has room in their house for 500 snakes to stretch out in an enclosure. No one has that amount of space, right? So now if the person were to adhere to that, now they can't have the number of snakes that they do. A lot of people are making, who are breeders are endeavoring to make money off of this. You can't make money off of the 20 snakes that you would actually have space for if you were to provide full-size enclosures, unless you had a lot of money and space yourself, right? So I think that that's where a lot of the pushback comes from, which I totally understand. In general, though, I haven't seen a rack system that I would call conducive along with good animal welfare. So I don't like them. Does that answer your question? Carrie, do you have anything to add?
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm generally looking at what choices are available to the animal, right? So that's where we start to look at things like hides and other things that are available. What are they able to do? How does that line up with what that animal in a native habitat would be able to do? So if they're not in human care, what choices and what options would they have for behavior? What would their behavior repertoire be? Am I able to engage all of that? If I'm not able to engage all of that, am I providing good welfare? It's those are the things that I would kind of look at. I mean, it comes back to too, a lot of times the discussion then comes back to, well, these are breeding animals, so they have access to do behavior that other animals might not, right? So a lot of reptiles don't have access to do things like breed or produce offspring, so they are able to do behavior that a lot of pet animals that are kept in larger habitats aren't. So how does that weigh? And then the other thing I hear a lot is that, well, these are neonates, these are babies, right? So this helps us provide a greater welfare, have a greater, less failure to thrive animals. We are able to raise more to maturity, right? So how, so to that, I would say I don't think we know developmentally everything that's going on in these neonates, or how that might be affecting their future behavior, how that learning history might be affecting their future behavior, setting them up. So those are questions that I have, things that I would like to explore more, and because I just don't have all the information. But I think those are things that are worth exploring and looking at. And if we get good answers to those, I think that could really drive the future of what these breeding systems look like. And it's not just breeders. There are other reasons to use racks, but I would say predominantly that's a large part of the rack system.
I would say across all, this is something that I've seen, I think, in both in zoo exhibits, aquariums, and but I think maybe more prevalent among pet owners. And I say this across all species kept within enclosures, right? So pretty much everything other than pet dogs and pet cats, and in some cases them as well, which is a little scary. But I see a lot of demands that people place on birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles, that they say, well, this is what they need. This is the way they have to be housed. This is what's necessary for that enclosure. If you do it this way, you've done it right. If you've done it this way, you've done it wrong. And it's a very black and white illustration. And then because people tend to treat things in very black and white ways like that, and particularly for behavior, which behavior is rarely so black and white like that, then you see people come up with tactics to resolve those issues. So they will say, oh, well, I know that this type of enclosure is bad for this animal, so I've come up with this kind of thing that you put in this enclosure and it solves all problems. And so I'm not even going to name anything, because I think everyone can bring something to mind that they think of like that. And I am very, the thing is, almost every one of those arguments exists in the absence of any data. And yet the people will then reference things, like they will say, well, I have this reference and I have that reference, and they'll use that. They'll make some type of claim. They will claim a backing of science in some way, but it often is not directly related. And it's I mean, I've seen this happen across the board for so many different species that I go, what do you know about the behavioral repertoire of those animals and why that's relevant? And what does that say about welfare for that animal? And so that's the one thing I want to keep in mind there, is just that all of these things are very much context dependent, and they can rely on data.
I think an interesting ethical question too would be, as we continue to provide more opportunities to these animals in human care, right? We can have ground dwelling snakes that like to climb. So if we now know that they like to climb, then is it ethical to not give them opportunities to climb? And how do we sort of manage these individual preferences? And I think that comes back to kind of bringing it back to the beginning of this discussion, where we're talking about building enclosures, not building enclosures and then putting the animal in and then trying to get behavior that way, but building the enclosure with the idea of letting the animals show us what they need, and
having the behavior
having
drive
the
the
prototype
design.
And having that, letting the animal drive the design, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
how can we do that? And is it, I don't know, if you do have a stand boa that likes to climb, is it ethical to not give them opportunities to climb because they're a sand boa and they should be doing sand boa things? And like how do we manage these type of discussions? I think it's interesting.
I would like to add quickly about in Tubbs. Bam! It's Bam Bam. I would like to add that I have 3 snakes currently in tubs that are have lighting, a heat source, substrate, plants, hides, so that the plastic is the same plastic that people use in racks. But in all of these, for all 3 of these snakes, well, Monday has just outgrown his, they are able to fully stretch out, all that kind of thing. So when that's part of the reason I wanted to be very clear about what I was addressing in terms of racks and tub systems, is that we're looking at the way that it's more traditionally done, versus it's not the plastic that's the problem. And whatnot to add to that. So I just wanted to add that quickly. Yeah. Do we have time for one more question?
We're getting there. I was going to throw in my last 2 inputs, which Kinsey, that's all very context. All of enrichment is very context dependent. I mean, enrichment is something that's defined by an interaction. It is not a stimulus. So let me just simply say that. I know I'm making everything, I say everything's context dependent because all behavior is context dependent. But if your idea of enrichment is, well, I threw in 10 toys and that's better than 5 toys, I would say, you know, honestly, if you throw in 10 toys and they interact with one of them, that it improves some welfare index, some welfare indice, that's better. You know, like you have 1 item, but you only, somebody else uses 2 items, but they spend a massive amount of time interacting with those 2 items. Obviously, the latter is better. So you can't quantify it by how much enrichment you're using, unless you're using a functional definition of enrichment, which is that it's an interaction. If you're calling enrichment stimuli, toys, stuff you're throwing in, that's already failing the definition. And Lori, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's one of the trickiest things is how do you, you know, again, it's offering as much choice, it's restricting as least behavior as possible. I think that's the most important thing for all organisms, human and non-human alike, is let's focus on choice as much as possible, on rewards for correct behavior as much as possible. And then with that, I try to keep all those things in mind and say, and I'm not in a position to judge.
Maybe someday I'll train a snake to free slither like my macaws who free fly. I wanted to add really quickly to Kinsey's thing, because one thing I think we've talked about is a lot about is you know, use their behavior to determine whether something is enriching or whether something is good or whether something is stressful. So I'll just add to that really quickly. If I was providing a lot of stimuli that I associated with, or a lot of stimuli that was enriching, right? So they behaved in a way that I would define that stimuli, that object or whatever, as enriching. Now, if I started adding more frequently all the time and they stopped interacting with those things, either altogether or to a lesser degree, started spending less time out and about or hiding more frequently, I would use that as information that maybe I'm overdoing it a bit and then rein it back in a little bit till I got back to behavior that I would see, that I would associate with being good and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to add that really quickly in terms of evaluating whether. Also, we teach snake training and reptile training classes where we go very in depth to all of that. And we're looking at doing some workshops as well. So
perfect. Carrie, any final thoughts?
I think these are all good discussions, and I hope that we all keep asking questions. And even if we don't have the answers, I hope that we keep asking the questions, and just keep getting better. I think it's really cool. I think for me, at least years ago, looking at things like training and enrichment for reptiles felt very isolating, and felt like very different from what most people were doing. I feel less and less and less that way. And I think it's cool to have this community, and I think that we need to use it as a resource, all of us as individual keepers, whether you are just starting out with your very first leopard gecko or whatever the case might be, or if you have 100 snakes, whatever the case might be, we all have something to bring, even if it's our question. And so I hope that we just keep talking like this.
Yeah, that's a very fitting ending. Thank you. That's perfect, Carrie. Yeah, keep
So
the
is
comment.
this.
And that's a tortoise.
That's what she was doing during a large portion of this talk, was just basking in her weirdo style with her legs all sprawled out and stuff. I was like, I think they need to see that. And Bruce has some stick stuck like sitting on his head, you know. Anyway.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
We'll put this video up. I'll put it up here in the next couple days, and then probably advertise it like midweek or so, mid to end next week sometime. Yeah, this is awesome. This is a good group. It was really great to get John out here to begin with.
Yeah, that was
John,
awesome.
yeah, John's wonderful. He's one of the most knowledgeable zoo people and one of the most important people to zoos on the planet that has ever existed. It's pretty amazing. So he's done a lot of really amazing things for exhibit design, and he's doing more stuff for reptiles. So that's really cool. And then hearing everything that you all are doing, of course, Peter and Carrie, awesome as always. So, and then we'll hang out for a little bit here for a second. But thanks everybody else, and you'll get to see more of this later.
Good to see you guys. I'm so excited to see all my students again, or our students again. It was really nice.
Have a good night or morning, wherever you are in the world.